Welcome back. So in the last video, we talked about supply and demand. We learned how to graph two equations, both our supply and demand equations. And we also learned how to solve for the market equilibrium by setting the quantity demanded equals to the quantity supplied. Okay. In this video, we want to talk about consumer and producer surplus. So before we do a quick example, I kind of just want to review what we talked about in lecture and just quickly review what consumer and producer surplus is. Okay, so remember that in econ we sort of use the term surplus. The idea of surplus basically is referring to the benefit that people are deriving from engaging in some market transaction. Okay, so consumer surplus specifically is the difference between the highest price that a consumer is willing to pay for a good or service and the actual price that the consumer pays, right? Likewise, the producer surplus is the difference between the lowest price that a firm would be willing to accept for some good or service that they are selling and the price that they actually receive. Okay, so for example, let's say that I'm looking at the market for MacBooks. Let's say that I value for myself MacBooks at $1,500. So that's my willingness to pay for a MacBook, because I am a consumer of MacBooks. But let's say that the market equilibrium price for the MacBook is $1,100, right? So if I'm willing to pay $1,500, but the market price is $1,100, then my individual consumer surplus from engaging in this transaction would be the difference between $1,500 and $1,100, right? So my consumer surplus would be $400. But let's say that I'm not the only consumer in the market, right? In most cases, we have several consumers. Okay, so we have this entire demand equation, this entire demand curve, the straight line, that tells us the different willingness to pay of several different consumers. Okay, so let's say we have some consumer right here. We'll call this guy consumer A. Well, his consumer A's consumer surplus is the difference between his willingness to pay, which is this price, right, that level, and the difference between that and the market price. Okay, so the difference between that point and this point on the y-axis, this is his consumer surplus. Okay, so this is individual A's consumer surplus. Well, individual A is not the only person in the market, right? We have individual B right here. This difference, this little strip right here, that's individual B's consumer surplus. We also have individual C. His consumer surplus is this strip, right? The difference between whatever he's willing to pay, he or she is willing to pay, and the P star, right, which is our market equilibrium price. And we have consumer D, all right? That difference, that's his consumer surplus. Okay, so we have all of these individuals. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking all these strips of all of the consumers who are participating in some market transaction, right? We're taking that and we're essentially adding up all of their consumer surpluses, right? This essentially comes out to be the area under this triangle, right? This top triangle. Sorry, my tracing is not too good, but that triangle right here, what I'm highlighting in green. Okay, let's highlight this in green. This area comes out to be our consumer surplus. Okay, and I'm going to write this down as well. This is our CS. I'm going to call it CS for consumer surplus. Okay. So why is it only this area, right? Well, let's look at the rest of our consumers on our demand curve, right? Let's focus on these people down here. Okay, we already talked about the people above the market equilibrium, but what about these people down here that I've highlighted in red? Well, let's say this is individual E, for example. Okay, his willingness to pay for this product, whatever it is lower than the market equilibrium, right? If his willingness to pay is lower than the actual price, then if we're assuming that individual E is a rational human being, then he's not going to participate in the market, right? He's not going to buy whatever good product or service, whatever is being sold here, he's not going to buy it, right? So we would say he's not participating in this transaction, right? And if he's not participating in the transaction, he's not buying anything, then his consumer surplus will just be zero, right? He was not going to have negative consumer surplus. We would just say that these people are not a part of the market because they are not buying anything. So their consumer surplus is going to be zero. Okay, so we don't want to focus on those individuals. So now let's talk about producer surplus. So just like consumer surplus, we now have our folks on the supply side of the market, right? We have all these folks on the supply side of the market, and just like we solved consumer surplus, producer surplus is the difference between the lowest price that a firm is willing to accept for a good or service and the price that it actually receives. Okay, the price that they're actually going to receive is the market price right here, right? This P star on the y-axis, that's the price that they actually receive. Well, let's say that we have some firm right here, right? They can produce, I'm just going to write firm A. Okay, let's say that firm A here can produce whatever product this is, let's say MacBooks, for very cheap. Well, maybe not MacBooks, let's just say maybe like laptops. Okay, let's generalize it since there are many firms that can make laptops. Okay, let's say that they can make very cheap computers, because they have high efficiency, or maybe they can obtain they can obtain inputs that they're going to use to make these computers for a lot cheaper. So their willingness to sell this good at is down here. Well, if they're actually receiving this price, the P star, right, the market equilibrium, then that's their producer surplus, right? That's their individual producer surplus. Now, if we have an individual right here, the difference between that and our market equilibrium, that's going to be their producer surplus. And just like that, we're just going to keep getting all these different producer surpluses, and we're just going to add them all up, okay? And that comes out to be the area of this triangle down here, okay? So this triangle right here, that's going to be producer surplus. Okay, and let me actually highlight this just like I did with the last one. Okay, sorry, it's not 100% precise, but you sort of get the idea. So this triangle down here, that's going to be our producer surplus. Okay, I'm going to write this as PS. Okay, so what we need to keep in mind is that the producer surplus is generally going to be below the market equilibrium, right? Producer surplus is below the market equilibrium, and consumer surplus is above the market equilibrium. Okay, and to solve for these, remember, we know the area of a triangle, right? We know that the area of a triangle is essentially 1/2 base times height, right? So we can solve for both consumer and producer surpluses, right? Now, if we want total surplus, remember that the total economic surplus is just going to be the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. Okay. So knowing that, we can now go to our example. So in the previous video, we had these two equations, right? We had quantity demanded is equal to 35 minus P. Quantity supplied is equal to -5 plus 3P. And remember, we solved for the equilibrium, right? We find equilibrium, again, when the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. We solved that P star is 10. We solved that Q star is 25. And we also graphed both of these equations, okay? And we learned a trick for graphing both equations. Okay, so here I have both equations graphed out. Just to save time, I didn't want to go through the process again. So let's now solve for our consumer surplus. Okay. So I want to find the consumer surplus, and we know that consumer surplus is just the area. Okay, let's sort of just depict it again. Is the area of this top triangle, right? Let's also highlight it very roughly. going to be the area of this top triangle. So consumer surplus. Okay, well, we know that consumer surplus is equal to 1/2 base times height. Okay, and lucky for us, since we've already done the graphing, we know what the base is, right? We know that the base is essentially this length right here, right? And this length is just from 0 all the way to 25, right? Because we have 25 as our equilibrium quantity. Okay, so that's going to be our base. So we're just going to plug that in. And we know what the height is as well, right? The height of this triangle is essentially from this point to this point right here. So we have this length, 35 minus 10, 25, right? That is going to be our height, okay? So now we can just plug this into a calculator, make sure I'm doing my math correctly. This will come out to be 312.5, okay? We'll say that this is in terms of dollars. So our consumer surplus is basically just $312.50, okay? So that's how we'd say it. That's the additional benefit that consumers are deriving by participating in this market transaction, okay? Now I want to find producer surplus. Okay, remember producer surplus is going to be this area of this bottom triangle, right? And we know the height and base of this as well, right? We know, again, the base is going to be the exact same, right? The base is essentially just this length right here, right? This strip is from 0 to 25. So we know that that's 25. So base is going to be 25. Now we want to know the height. Well, the height, again, is from this point to this point, okay? Notice here that our supply equation, the way it was, it's not going to start at the origin, okay? So a common mistake that I've seen people make in the past is that they sort of just assume that the height is from the equilibrium to 0, okay? That's not the case. Because notice that there's a gap here, and our actual y-intercept is this point right here, okay? So our height is not from 10 all the way down to 0, okay? That would be incorrect. Our height is actually from 10 all the way to 5/3, right? This is our y-intercept of the supply equation, so this is going to be our height, okay? And that's going to be the difference between 10 and 5/3. So 10 minus 5/3. Okay, so let's plug this into a calculator very quickly. And we're going to come up with $104, and I'm just going to round this to 2 decimal places, so 104.17, okay? So that's going to be our producer surplus. All right. Great, so now that we've done this, right, we found our consumer surplus, we found our producer surplus using the concepts that we learned both now and also in lecture. Now if I want to find the total surplus, remember my total surplus is just my consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. Okay, so my total surplus, I'm going to denote this as TS. This is just going to be 312, right? 312.5 plus 104.17, okay? So it'll come out to be roughly 416.67. Okay, so this total surplus, this is the total economic surplus that exists from both the consumer side as well as the producer side to those individuals who are participating in the market. Okay, to those individuals who are participating or engaging in this market transaction. Okay, so yeah, that's about it for this video.